Breakwater House, the night the illusion finally burned. The air tastes of salt and scorched canvas, a sharp chemical tang that coats my throat. My name is Marcia Hart, and I am standing in the wreckage of my brother's engagement party while police lights carve through the fog. My parents think this fire is a tragedy. They can pin on me a convenient way to hide 20 years of theft behind the story of an unstable daughter. They believe they have trapped me in a narrative I cannot escape. But they forgot that even a scapegoat eventually learns how to bite back. Join me as I dismantle their perfect life. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air at Breakwater House always tastes like salt and old money, a distinct blend of brine and copper that coats the back of your throat. Tonight, however, it was masked by the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the distinct ozone tang of an impending storm. The engagement party for my brother Spencer and his fiancée Lila was in full swing, a showcase of the Hart family's desperate need to appear flawless. The main reception tent sat on the manicured lawn dangerously close to the shoreline, where the ground was already soft and weeping from the afternoon drizzle. String lights hung in complex geometric webs overhead, casting a warm, golden glow over 200 guests who were drinking champagne and laughing that specific hollow laugh rich people use when they're bored, but polite. I stood near the periphery, gripping a glass of sparkling water like it was a shield. I wasn't supposed to be scrutinizing the infrastructure, but habits from my job as a paralegal die hard. I noticed details. I noticed liability. And what I noticed made the hair on my arms stand up. The setup was sloppy. Extension cords were snaking through the wet grass held down by nothing more than silver duct tape that was already peeling in the damp air. To my right, near the service entrance of the tent, a temporary power distribution box was humming. It wasn't a steady industrial hum. It was a struggling, erratic buzz like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. It looked cheap, undersized for the massive lighting rig, and the heavy-duty heaters blasting warm air into the tent. I felt eyes on me, and turned to see my mother Elaine watching me from across the room. She wasn't smiling. Her gaze was tracking me, dissecting my posture, checking my location. She wasn't looking at me like a daughter. She was tracking a liability. She was waiting for me to break to cause a scene, to be the problem she had spent 20 years telling everyone I was. I adjusted my dress, a simple navy sheath I'd bought with my own salary, and tried to look invisible. I didn't want trouble. I just wanted to survive the night and go back to my quiet, orderly life in the city. Then the hum from the distribution box changed pitch. It turned into a sharp, violent crack. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion. There was no fireball that consumed the tent in seconds. It was simpler and terrifyingly mechanical. A short hit the temporary power unit. I saw the spark, bright blue and angry, arc from the box to the wet canvas of the tent wall. The fabric treated or not caught instantly. A line of smoke bloomed thick and black, curling up toward the ceiling. The lights flickered and died, plunging the tent into a gray gloom, illuminated only by the growing flame at the base of the wall. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then someone screamed. Chaos isn't cinematic. It's ugly. The guests stampeded. Chairs were overturned, glass shattered under frantic heels, and the politeness evaporated instantly. A waiter went down hard, knocking over a tray of flutes. I didn't freeze. I moved. I ran toward the service corridor, shouting for someone to kill the breaker. I saw an elderly woman struggling to get up near the exit and hauled her to her feet, shoving her toward the open air. I grabbed a red canister from the support pole, a fire extinguisher, and yanked the pin. I aimed at the base of the fire, the white powder choking the flames, battling the electrical arc that was still spitting sparks onto the wet ground. I had the fire suppressed within 30 seconds, right as the emergency lights kicked on. I was coughing, my hands covered in white residue, my heart hammering against my ribs. I turned, expecting relief, expecting someone to take the canister from my shaking hands. Instead, I found my mother. She stood 5 feet away, illuminated by the harsh beam of a security flashlight. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at me. Marcia. she said, her voice cutting through the lingering smoke. Why were you back there? To understand why that question felt like a knife in the gut, you have to understand the architecture of my family. I am the Hart family scapegoat. It is a role I was assigned somewhere around adolescence, a narrative constructed to explain away the cracks in our perfect facade. I'm 28 years old now. I have a stable job at a mid-sized law firm where I manage complex probate filings. I am meticulous, boring, and reliable. But in this house, I am the volatile one. I am the one who spirals. The tension started years ago when I began asking about Grandmother Hazel's estate. I knew she had left trusts for both Spencer and me. When I turned 25, I asked for the documentation. My father, Richard, sat me down in his study and sighed, looking at me with a pity that made my skin crawl. The money is gone, Marcia, he had said, his voice gentle, paternal. We spent it on your care, on your therapy, on getting you through school when you were unstable. They never showed me the ledgers. They never produced the receipts. When I pressed, they diagnosed me. You're obsessing again, my mother would say. You're rewriting history because you can't handle the truth. They gaslit me so effectively that for years I believed them. I believed I was broken. I believed I had cost them a fortune. I stopped asking questions because every question was met with a new concern for my mental health. I moved out, built a life where everything was documented, where facts mattered, and I stayed away. I hadn't planned on coming tonight. The invitation hadn't come in the mail. It came via a phone call from Spencer 3 weeks ago. It was late, and his voice was low, sounding stripped of his usual golden boy confidence. I want you here, Mar, he had said. Please. It doesn't feel right doing this without you. Mom and Dad won't want me there, I had replied, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. I don't care what they want. You're my sister. Please, just come and be normal for me tonight. Show them they're wrong about you. That was the hook. The soft spot in my armor. The part of me that still desperately wanted a family, that wanted to prove I wasn't the disaster they painted me to be. I wanted to show up, look elegant, smile at the right times, and prove that Marcia Hart was a functional adult. I wanted to give Spencer his perfect night. That desire to be helpful was exactly how they trapped me. Earlier in the evening, before the lights went out, I had been cornered near the restrooms by Dina Torres, the event planner. I recognized her from the endless email chain Spencer had CC'd me on weeks ago regarding the guest list. She looked frantic, clutching a clipboard like a life preserver. Hey, Marcia, right? She had breathless asked, spotting me. Thank God, your family. Can you help me? I need to swap the seating cards for table 6. The bride's aunt just canceled and I can't find any of my staff. Sure, I said. It was a small thing, a normal thing. Hold this door open for me. The latch is broken, and if it shuts, I'm locked out of the service corridor. So I did. I stood by the service entrance holding the heavy metal door while she darted in to grab the new placards. I was standing right next to the humming power distribution box. I was standing right where the fire started. I was there because I was asked to be there, and at least 3 catering staff saw me standing there, looking anxious, waiting for Dina. But now, standing in the smoke, watching the flashing lights of the police cruisers bouncing off the wet grass, I realized how that helpfulness was going to look. The fire department had arrived along with a patrol car. The injured guest, a woman who had twisted her ankle in the stampede, was being treated by EMTs. A heavy-set police officer was talking to a young catering assistant near the tent entrance. My father was standing next to the officer, his hand resting paternally on the cop's shoulder. I watched the catering assistant point a shaking finger at me. I saw her, the kid stammered. She was back there right before it sparked. She was messing with the cords. He wasn't lying, not exactly. He had seen me near the cords. He had seen me holding the door, but in the chaos his brain had filled in the gaps with the most dramatic explanation available. I stepped forward, my voice rising. I was holding the door for the planner. Dina, ask Dina. My father stepped between me and the officer. He held up a hand, silencing me. Officer, I'm so sorry. Richard said, his voice dripping with tragic embarrassment. My daughter, she has a history of episodes. When she gets overwhelmed, she acts out. I didn't act out, I shouted, realizing too late that shouting only validated his narrative. It was a short circuit. Look at the wiring, it's taped together with duct tape. My mother glided over, looking perfectly composed despite the soot on her hem. She placed a hand on the officer's arm. She was very upset earlier. Elaine lied, her voice smooth as glass. She stormed off after we spoke about Spencer. She's had a very hard time accepting that he's moving on with his life. The officer looked at me. He didn't see a woman who had just put out a fire. He saw a hysterical sister standing over the wreckage of her brother's engagement party, screaming about duct tape while her calm, wealthy parents apologized for her existence. The trap snapped shut. I felt the cold realization wash over me, chilling me deeper than the sea spray. They weren't asking questions to find out what happened. They were building a container for the blame. The accident, the cheap wiring, the negligence, the danger was being repurposed in real time. It was no longer a liability lawsuit waiting to happen. It was a weapon. And they were pointing it straight at me. The arrival of Leonard Voss shifted the atmosphere from chaotic to predatory. Voss has been the Hart family attorney for 30 years, a man who wears three-piece suits to beach barbecues and speaks in a voice that sounds like gravel wrapping around a velvet throat. He didn't run toward the tent. He materialized out of the darkness, stepping between me and the police officer with the ease of a man who owns every room he enters. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't look at the burn marks on my hands. He looked at the officer's badge number, then at my father. Officer, Voss said, his tone conciliatory but firm. I think we can all agree that tensions are high. Miss Hart has had a difficult evening. We don't need to make this a matter for the precinct tonight. The family will take custody of her. The officer hesitated, his pen hovering over his notepad. She was identified near the ignition point, sir, and there's witness testimony regarding erratic behavior. Distress, Voss corrected smoothly. Not malice. Look at her, she's shaken. The Harts are prepared to cover all damages to the venue and handle the medical expenses for the injured guest privately. Let's get Marcia home so she can receive the care she needs. My parents were nodding, their faces masks of tragic concern. Come home, Marcia, my mother said softly, reaching for my arm. We'll call Dr. Aris in the morning. We'll get you settled. That word settled triggered a primal alarm in the base of my skull. I knew what home meant. It meant the guest house with the keypad locks. It meant my phone disappearing, for my own good. It meant being medicated until I was too foggy to remember why I was angry. They weren't trying to keep me out of jail. They were trying to keep me offline. If I went with them, the narrative would be cemented by mourning troubled daughter sets fire to brother's engagement party in jealous fit. I took a step back, breaking my mother's grip. I'm not going with you. Marcia, don't make a scene, my father warned, his voice dropping an octave. You are in no state to drive. I'm sober, I'm employed, and I'm an adult, I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for the officer to hear. I turned to the cop. Am I under arrest? Am I being detained? The officer looked between Voss and me. He saw a wealthy family trying to handle a domestic issue, and he saw a woman who, despite the soot on her face, was speaking in complete sentences. He didn't want the paperwork. You're not under arrest, ma'am, but I will need your statement and contact information. You have it, I said, rattling off my address and phone number before Voss could intervene. I am leaving now. Marcia, Voss said, stepping into my path. If you walk away, we cannot protect you from the legal fallout of this incident. I'll take my chances, I snapped. I turned and walked toward the parking lot. I forced myself not to run. I could feel their eyes on my back, my mother's disappointment, my father's rage, Voss's calculation. I got into my sedan, locked the doors, and didn't exhale until I was 5 miles down the coast highway. I pulled into a gravel turnout overlooking the ocean, killed the engine, and fell apart. My hands shook so hard I couldn't unbuckle my seatbelt. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air in the dark. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I was one person against an institution. I fumbled for my phone and called the only person in my life who didn't think the sun rose and set on Richard Harts, Sarah, the senior partner at my firm. She answered on the second ring. Marcia, it's late. Is everything okay? There was a fire, I choked out. At the party. They're saying I started it. They tried to take me to the house. Where are you? Her voice shifted instantly from sleepy to litigator. In my car, on Route 1. Good. Do not go back inside that house alone, she ordered. Do not answer their calls. Do not sign anything. Go to your apartment, lock the door, and write down everything you remember. Every conversation, every timestamp. Resilience isn't about fighting them tonight, Marcia. It's about refusing to be isolated. Go home. Her voice grounded me. I wasn't a crazy person. I was a paralegal in a bad situation. I wiped my face, started the car, and drove back to the city. I slept fitfully, waking up to a phone full of missed calls from my parents and a single text message from a number I didn't have saved. It came through at 3:14 a.m. It's Dina. I shouldn't be sending this. But I know you didn't touch those cords. That power setup wasn't what I ordered. Someone swapped the rental company last minute without telling me. I'm scared, Marcia. If I speak up, I lose the Hart account, but this feels wrong. I stared at the screen. It was the first crack in the wall. Dina was risking her entire business by sending this. If the setup was swapped, the fire wasn't just an accident, it was negligence born of a cut corner. Or worse. I needed to understand why. Why swap a vendor for a high-profile event to save money? My parents were obsessed with appearances. They didn't pinch pennies on lighting. I couldn't sit in my apartment waiting for the police to knock. I needed to find the root of the rot. I grabbed my keys and drove to the one place my parents had no jurisdiction. A humidity-controlled storage unit on the outskirts of town, where I kept the few things I had salvaged from my childhood. The unit smelled of dust and old cedar. I dug through the back past winter coats and college textbooks until I found the plastic bin marked Hazel. My grandmother had been the only one who saw me. She was sharp-tongued wealthy in her own right and deeply suspicious of my father's business acumen. When she died, I had taken a handful of papers from her desk before the estate lawyers swept the house. I sat on the concrete floor under the buzzing fluorescent light and spread the papers out. Most of it was sentimental letters photos. But at the bottom was a copy of a trust summary from 10 years ago. It was a single page, wrinkled and coffee-stained. It listed two beneficiaries, Spencer Hart and Marcia Hart. The trust was supposed to vest when we turned 25. I scanned the figures. The principal amount was staggering. Millions. Enough to fund a life, a business, a future. My parents claimed it was gone spent on my care. But looking at the dates, the math didn't hold up. I had been in therapy, yes. I had gone to a private college, but that wouldn't drain a fund of this size. Then I saw it. A handwritten note in the margin in Hazel's spidery script. Monitor transfer to Archer Holdings. R. Insists on management rights. Archer Holdings. I had never heard of it. I took a picture of the document and the note. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a compass heading. My phone pinged with an email notification. It was from Voss's office. Subject urgent. Family resolution proposal. I opened the attachment on my phone. It was a masterpiece of legal coercion. The document was titled A Family Resolution Agreement. It offered to cover my defense regarding the incident, pay for comprehensive wellness treatment, and provide a monthly stipend for 2 years. In exchange, I had to agree to 3 things. 1. Admission that the fire was a result of accidental negligence on my part due to distress. 2. A permanent non-disparagement clause preventing me from speaking about the Hart family or their business dealings to the press or third parties. 3. A full release of any and all claims against the Hart Family Trust and the estate of Hazel Hart. I laughed a harsh sound in the empty storage unit. They weren't just covering up a fire. They were trying to buy my silence on the trust. They needed me to sign away my right to investigate the money in exchange for protection from the arson narrative they had invented. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to the industrial district to the address of the rental company Dina had originally booked Lumina events. The manager, a guy named Steve, was defensive the moment I walked in. "Look, we didn't do the breakwater job," he said, holding up his hands. "I heard about the fire. That wasn't our gear." "I know," I said, putting my paralegal face on. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm trying to figure out who took the job." "We had a contract," Steve said, annoyed. "Signed and everything. Then 2 days before the party we get a call canceling it. Said they found someone cheaper. I had to eat the deposit." "Who called?" "Some guy, rude as hell. Didn't give a name, just said he was the property manager for the estate. Demanded the refund in cash, which I didn't do, obviously." Steve typed something into his computer. "Here. I noted it because he was such a prick. He drove a black truck, had a logo on his polo. Apex something." "Apex. Yeah. Apex Management, maybe." "He left an invoice on the counter by mistake when he was yelling at me, then grabbed it back. But I saw the header. The new gear came from a shell company lady. That wiring. It was probably garbage brought in to skim the difference off the budget." "Can you describe him?" "Mid-30s, buzz cut, scar over his left eyebrow." My stomach turned over. I knew him. That was Gary Voss's fixer. He wasn't a property manager. He was the guy Voss sent to handle evictions and intimidate tenants. So Voss had canceled the legitimate safe lighting company and replaced it with a cheap, dangerous alternative, likely pocketing the difference or funneling the contract to a friend. And when it caught fire, I was the convenient cover story. I needed to talk to Spencer. He was the only other person with a stake in that trust, and the only person in the family who possessed a conscience, however dormant. I knew he wouldn't be at the estate. The smell of smoke would be too much for Lila. I found him at the marina, sitting on the back of his boat, staring at the water. He looked wrecked. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was nursing a tumbler of scotch despite it being barely noon. "Marcia," he said, not looking up. "You shouldn't be here. Dad is furious." "Dad is a liar, Spencer." I stepped onto the boat. "And Voss is a thief." "Don't start," he groaned. "I can't handle your conspiracy theories today. Lila is devastated. The wedding is postponed." "The fire was caused by faulty wiring from a company Voss hired," I said, my voice hard. "Dina didn't book them. Voss's guy Gary did. They swapped the safe gear for cheap junk to skim money. And now they want me to sign a paper admitting I did it in exchange for waiving my rights to grandmother's trust." Spencer flinched. He looked at me, then really looked at me. "Waiving rights to the trust. Read it." I shoved my phone in his face, displaying the contract. Clause 3. Why do they care about the trust, Spencer? They told us it was gone. Spencer turned pale. He set the drink down with a trembling hand. They told me it was complicated." "What was complicated?" "The money. For the ring. For my startup." He ran a hand through his hair. "I asked for a distribution last year. Dad said the liquid cash wasn't there, but he could facilitate a loan against future inheritance. He made me sign papers with an investment firm, Archer Holdings." "Archer Holdings." I repeated the name from Hazel's note, crashing into the present. "Spencer, that's the shell company. Dad isn't lending you money. He's lending you your own money and charging you interest on it." "No," Spencer whispered. "He wouldn't." "He is stealing from us," I said, grabbing his shoulders. "And the fire? It happened because they got greedy with the party budget, and now they need me to take the fall so no one looks at the books. I need the documents, Spencer. The loan papers you signed. Where are they?" "In my safe at the apartment," he said weakly. "But Marcia, if you do this, if you expose him, it burns everything down." "It's already burning," I said. "I'm just trying to get us out of the building." I left him there conflicted and sick, but I had the target now. Archer Holdings. The next 6 hours were a blur of caffeine and government databases. I went back to my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and started digging. I pulled the LLC filings for Archer Holdings. It was registered in Delaware, opaque and anonymous, but I kept pulling threads. I searched for property records linked to the LLC. I found a commercial building purchased 3 years ago. The deed was signed by an agent. I cross-referenced the agent's address. It matched a P.O. box used by Voss's law firm. Then came the real hit. I searched for liens against the LLC. I found a mechanic's lien from a contractor who hadn't been paid for renovations on a property owned by Archer. The contractor had included email correspondence in the filing as proof of work. The emails weren't from an anonymous manager. They were from rart@hartinvestments.com. My father. He was running the LLC. He was moving trust money into it, then lending it back to the family, or using it to buy properties he controlled, likely washing the funds to hide them from tax liability and from us. I needed an expert to make it stick. I couldn't afford a high-priced forensic accountant, but I knew people. I called David, a guy I'd worked with on a probate case years ago who had gone independent. I sent him the screenshots, the trust summary, and the public records. He called me back an hour later. "Marcia, this is messy," he said. "But it looks like a classic bleed-out. The trust isn't empty, it's being siphoned. If that LLC is funded by trust assets and your father is the beneficial owner, that's embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. It's a felony. But you need the bank statements to prove the flow." "I'm working on it," I said. "Be careful," David warned. "People go to jail for this. People kill for less." He was right to warn me. The escalation didn't take long. At 7:00 p.m. there was a heavy knock on my door. I checked the peephole. Police. Not the officer from the party, 2 uniformed officers I didn't recognize. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened the door a crack, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you?" "Marcia Hart?" the older officer asked. "We received a call requesting a wellness check. A family member is concerned you might be a danger to yourself. They reported you sent threatening text messages suggesting self-harm." It was the unstable narrative weaponized. If they could get me on a psychiatric hold even for 72 hours, Voss could get a conservatorship order, or at least destroy my credibility permanently. "I haven't sent any such messages," I said, keeping my voice steady though my knees were water. "I am perfectly fine. I am eating dinner and working." "We need to come in and verify that, ma'am." "Do you have a warrant?" I asked. "We don't need one for a wellness check if there's probable cause." "Who called it in?" "Your father, Richard Hart." I took a deep breath. "Officer, my father and I are in a legal dispute regarding a family trust. This call is a harassment tactic. I am stepping out into the hall so you can see I am physically unharmed. I am recording this interaction on my phone for my protection." I stepped out holding my phone up, camera rolling. I spoke clearly. "My name is Marcia Hart. It is Tuesday, 7:15 p.m. I am sober, calm, and safe. I deny any allegations of self-harm. These officers are verifying my status." The officers looked uncomfortable. They saw a woman in business casual attire recording them with professional detachment. The hysterical daughter story didn't match the reality standing in front of them. "She seems okay to me," the younger officer muttered. "We just have to check, ma'am," the older one said, his tone softening. "If you say you're fine, we'll log it. But maybe call your dad." He sounded worried. "I'll handle it through my attorney," I said. "Am I free to go back inside?" "Yes, ma'am." I closed the door and locked every lock I had. I slid down against the wood, shaking. They were trying to swat me. They were trying to have me committed. The gloves were off. There was no going back to being the quiet daughter. I checked my email. A notification from the local society page caught my eye. First Responders Benefit Gala. Hosted by the Hart family. It was scheduled for tomorrow night. A thank you reception for the firefighters and police who responded to the engagement party fire. My parents were spinning the disaster into a PR victory. They were going to stand on a stage, look benevolent, and accept applause for cleaning up a mess they created, all while painting me as the tragedy they had to endure. It was bold, it was arrogant, and it was the perfect battlefield. I looked at the pile of evidence on my coffee table, Dina's text, the rental invoice I'd pulled from Steve's system, the LLC filings, the trust summary, and the resolution agreement that tried to gag me. I wasn't going to hide in my apartment waiting for them to break down the door. I wasn't going to let them control the story from a podium while I cowered in the dark. I picked up my phone and called Dina. "Are you still scared?" I asked. "Terrified," she whispered. "Good. Use that. I need you to print the original order forms. I need you to come to the gala tomorrow." "Marcia, I can't. They'll ruin me." "They'll ruin you anyway when the insurance investigation finds the bad wiring," I said. "Your only way out is the truth. Stand with me and we end this." There was a long silence, then a sigh. "What time?" "7, I said. "Wear something sharp. We're going to crash a party." I hung up. The fear was still there, cold and heavy in my stomach, but it was different now. It wasn't the fear of a victim. It was the fear of a soldier before the charge. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need to scream. I just need to walk into that room and staple the truth to the wall. The First Responders Appreciation Gala was being held in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, a venue chosen specifically because it was inland fireproof and screamed stability. The room was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns, the air thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive lilies. My parents had spared no expense in their effort to pivot the narrative. Enormous blown-up photographs of the tragic accident stood on easels in the lobby, artfully cropped to show the heroic firefighters while conveniently omitting the cheap melted wiring that had caused the blaze. I stood outside the double mahogany doors, checking my reflection in the brass handle. I wasn't wearing the frantic soot-stained dress from the night before. I was wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and trousers armor. Beside me stood Dina, looking pale but resolute, clutching a thick file folder to her chest. Flanking us was Mason, a friend from my gym who happened to be a 6'4" retired Marine. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to exist, a silent physical boundary that said, "Don't touch her." "Ready?" I asked Dina. She took a shaky breath. "I'm never working in this town again after this, am I?" "You weren't going to work in this town anyway once they pinned the negligence on you," I reminded her. "This way you keep your license." I pushed the doors open. The hum of conversation didn't die immediately. It rippled away from us like a wave as we walked down the center aisle. My mother was on the stage, standing at the podium next to the fire chief, holding an oversized check meant for the department's benevolent fund. She looked radiant, the picture of a benevolent matriarch recovering from a family crisis. My father stood a step behind her, looking solemn and responsible. When they saw me, the smile didn't leave my mother's face, but her eyes went dead. It was a terrifying disconnect. My father stiffened his hand, twitching toward the inside of his jacket, as if checking for a wallet or a weapon. Two security guards in ill-fitting suits stepped into the aisle to intercept us. They moved with the aggressive confidence of men who had been told exactly who to target. "Miss Hart," the lead guard said, blocking my path 10 feet from the stage. "You're not on the list. You need to leave immediately." "I'm a member of the Hart Family Trust," I said, my voice projecting clearly in the sudden silence of the room. "And I have relevant business with the board." Leonard Voss appeared from the shadows of the stage left wing, moving with the speed of a striking cobra. He descended the stairs, his face a mask of polite concern, but his eyes were drilling into mine. He stopped next to the guards, keeping his voice low, intended only for me and the front row of donors. "Marcia," Voss hissed, a smile plastered on his face. "This is a private charity event. You are trespassing. If you don't turn around, you are risking arrest for harassment and breach of peace. We will drag you out." "I don't think you will," I said calmly. I nodded to Mason, who took a half-step forward, crossing his arms. The security guards hesitated. They were paid to bounce drunks, not fight Marines. "This is a mistake," Voss warned, his veneer of politeness slipping. You are embarrassing yourself. Your parents are trying to protect you. No, I said, stepping around him. They are trying to silence me. I didn't run to the stage. I walked. I walked past the table where the mayor sat with his mouth slightly open. I walked past Spencer and Lila. Spencer looked sick, his face gray under the ballroom lights. I caught his eye and held it. Look at me, I willed him. Look at what they did. I stopped at the base of the stairs. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need to. The acoustics of the ballroom meant that if I spoke clearly, the silence would carry my voice to the back of the room. I apologize for the interruption, I said to the crowd. But since this evening is about the fire at Breakwater House, I thought it was important to clarify the cause. Security! My father roared, the fatherly mask shattering instantly. Get her out of here. She's having an episode. I'm not having an episode, Richard. I said, dropping the dad. I'm having an audit. I gestured to Dina. She stepped forward, her hands shaking but her voice clear. She opened her folder and pulled out a stack of documents, holding them up. My name is Dina Torres, she announced. I was the event planner for the engagement party. I ordered a standard safety-rated power distribution system from Lumina Events. Here's the contract. She held up the paper. 2 days before the event, without my knowledge, that order was canceled by a Mr. Gary Signs, an employee of Apex Management. The equipment that caused the fire was substituted by Apex. It was not rated for outdoor use. A murmur went through the room. The fire chief, still holding the corner of the oversized check, looked down at my mother. That's a lie, Voss shouted, abandoning the whisper. This is a disgruntled vendor covering her tracks. Beat 2, I said softly to myself. I pulled the second set of documents from my bag. Apex Management isn't a vendor, I said, turning to face the room. And neither is the company that supplied the faulty wiring. They are shell companies. I pulled the public records this morning. I walked over to the table where the press were seated, the local Gazette, a few bloggers. I laid the papers down in front of them. Apex Management is a subsidiary of Archer Holdings, I explained, pointing to the highlighted names. Archer Holdings is an LLC registered in Delaware. Its purchasing agent is Leonard Voss. Its beneficiary is Richard Hart. My father's face went purple. You ungrateful little... You hired yourself to wire the party. I cut him off, my voice cold and hard. You canceled the safe equipment to save $4,000, and you pocketed the difference through a shell company. And when it caught fire, you tried to pin it on me because you knew I had a history you could exploit. The room was freezing. The clinking of silverware had stopped entirely. This wasn't a family squabble. This was fraud. But it's not just about the party, I continued, pulling out the final sheaf of papers. I was told my grandmother's trust was empty, spent on my medical care. But here are the bank transfer records. I held up the spreadsheets David, the accountant, had helped me assemble. Monthly transfers from the Hart Family Trust into Archer Holdings, starting 5 years ago. You didn't spend the money on me, you stole it. You moved it into an LLC you control, and then you used that LLC to loan money back to your own son. I turned to Spencer. He was standing now, gripping the edge of the table. Spencer, I said, holding out a single sheet of paper. The loan for the ring, the startup capital. Look at the lender name. Spencer walked toward me. It was a slow, heavy walk, like a man moving through deep water. He took the paper. He stared at it. It says Archer Holdings, he whispered. His voice cracked. He looked up at our father on the stage. Dad, you said Archer was an investment bank. It is, Richard stammered, sweating now. It's a vehicle for tax efficiency, Spencer. You don't understand high finance. Marcia is twisting this. The interest rate is 7%, Spencer said, his voice rising. You lent me my own inheritance and charged me 7% interest. It was for your own good. Elaine shrieked from the podium, the glowing matriarch gone, replaced by a cornered animal. We built this life for you. We protect this family. Marcia is trying to destroy us because she's jealous. She's always been jealous. I'm not jealous, Mother, I said. I'm finished. I played the final card. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter. I took the yellowed envelope from my pocket, Hazel's letter. Grandmother Hazel knew, I said to the silent room. She left this in her safety deposit box. She wrote it the week before she died. I unfolded the letter. My son Richard believes that family money is his money, I read aloud. He will try to absorb the trusts. He will call it management. He will call it protection. But it is theft. If you are reading this, Marcia, it means he has already tried to erase you to get to the accounts. I lowered the letter. He didn't just steal the money. He tried to steal my name. He tried to have me committed yesterday. He tried to coerce me into signing a false confession for arson, all to hide the fact that he was funneling cash into a shell company. I looked at the fire chief. The fire wasn't an accident caused by a mentally ill woman. It was industrial negligence caused by a fraudulent vendor owned by the host. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. It wasn't the dramatic, gasping silence of a movie. It was the thick, uncomfortable silence of a room full of powerful people realizing they were standing next to a contagion. My father looked at the crowd. He tried to laugh, a desperate wheezing sound. This is absurd, a misunderstanding. We can explain everything in the proper forum. Lila Spencer's fiancé stood up. She was the daughter of a judge, a woman who cared about reputation more than oxygen. She walked over to Spencer, took the loan document from his hand, and read it. Then she looked at my father. Mr. Hart, she said, her voice ice cold. I would like copies of all these documents. Lila, sweetheart, my mother pleaded. Now, Lila said. The spell broke. The room began to move. But they weren't moving toward the stage to offer support. They were moving away. Guests were checking their phones, signaling for valets turning their backs. The press were typing furiously on laptops. The police officer who had been providing security for the mayor stepped forward. He didn't approach me. He approached the stage. Mr. Hart, the officer said, we're going to need to have a conversation about these permits. My father looked at Voss, but the lawyer was already retreating, tapping furiously on his BlackBerry, putting distance between himself and the client he had failed to contain. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I felt a profound, exhausting sadness. I looked at Spencer. He was crying, silent tears running down his face as he looked at the parents he had worshipped, finally seeing the monsters underneath the masks. I'm sorry, he mouthed to me. I know, I said. I turned to Dina. Let's go. We walked out of the ballroom, past the frozen security guards, past the easels with the heroic photos. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the sound of the Hart family legacy crumbling behind me, not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of paper and the whisper of people walking away. I had stapled the truth to the wall, and it held. The thing about burning down a house of cards is that you still have to deal with the mess on the floor. The climax didn't end at the podium with a gavel bang and a freeze frame. It bled out into the days and weeks that followed, a slow, grinding process of legal dissection that was far less cinematic than the confrontation. The fallout was immediate and dirty. The morning after the gala, the Meridian Hotel issued a sterile press release distancing themselves from the private family dispute. By noon, the district attorney's office had opened a preliminary inquiry not into the fire, but into the financial irregularities of the Hart Family Trust. The insurance adjusters for Breakwater House, who had initially been happy to accept the accident theory, suddenly became very interested in the vendor invoices Dina had provided. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt hollowed out. I spent my days in Sarah's office at the firm answering questions from investigators, handing over the thumb drives of evidence I'd compiled, and watching my parents' carefully constructed world disintegrate in real time. The social recoil was the most nauseating part. The same people who had watched me being gaslit for a decade, who had nodded sympathetically when my mother whispered about my instability, were now rewriting their own histories. I ran into Mrs. Albright, a woman who had known me since I was 6 at the coffee shop near the courthouse. A week ago, she would have crossed the street to avoid me. Now she stopped placing a manicured hand on my arm. "I always wondered about those accounts, Marcia," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your father was always so aggressive with his investments. We all suspected something wasn't quite right." She was lying. She hadn't suspected a thing. She just didn't want to be associated with the losing side. I looked at her, saw the fear behind her eyes, the fear that maybe her own husband's investments wouldn't hold up to scrutiny either, and I just nodded. "The truth usually comes out, Mrs. Albright," I said, and walked away. I didn't have the energy to call her out. I was saving my energy for the people who actually mattered. Spencer came to see me 3 days after the gala. He looked 10 years older. The golden boy shine was gone, replaced by a gray exhaustion that matched my own. He came to my apartment standing in the doorway like a stranger. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He walked into my small living room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. He noticed the lack of expensive art, the second-hand furniture, the life I had built on a paralegal's salary while he was living on a loan from his own trust fund. He sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing his hands. "I talked to the DA," he said quietly. "I gave them everything. The loan papers, the emails Dad sent me about the investment strategy. I'm cooperating fully." "Good," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I kept my distance. "I didn't know, Mar," he said, looking up at me, his eyes pleading. "I swear, I thought Archer Holdings was legit. I thought I was just doing what Dad said was best for the family." "I know you didn't know about the shell company," I said. "But you knew they were cutting me out. You knew they told me the money was gone, and you never asked where your money was coming from." He flinched. "I was scared. I didn't want to rock the boat. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner." He wanted me to hug him. He wanted me to tell him it was okay that we were victims together, that we would rebuild the family. But I couldn't do that. The gap between us wasn't just about money, it was about courage. "I accept your apology, Spencer," I said. "But I'm not going to fix this for you. I can't be your emotional support while I'm still healing from the wounds you helped inflict." "I just want to help," he said, his voice cracking. "Then testify," I said. "Tell the truth on the stand, not just to me. I'll work with the truth, Spencer. But I won't work with guilt. If you want a relationship with me, it starts after the depositions are done." It was a hard boundary, maybe the hardest I'd ever set. But as he nodded and left, I realized it was the first time I had ever treated him as an equal, rather than a project or an idol. Not everyone abandoned me, though. The community support came from unexpected places. Dina Torres took a hit. She lost 2 major clients who were friends of my parents, but she gained a reputation for absolute integrity. She posted a statement online backed by the invoices, and the local event industry rallied around her. She met me for a drink a week later, looking tired but lighter. "I lost the prestige accounts," she told me, clinking her beer against mine, "but I sleep at night. And honestly, the clients calling me now are the ones who actually pay their bills on time." Mason, my Marine friend, helped me navigate the practical safety concerns. He drove me to the first few legal meetings, ensuring no one from my father's security team tried to intimidate me. And then there was Mr. Henderson, a retired actuary who lived in my building. He had always been polite but distant. The day after the news broke about the indictment, he stopped me in the lobby. "I read the filings," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The forensic accounting, impressive work, Ms. Hart. Very thorough. It takes a strong spine to stand up to a parent." He didn't offer pity. He offered respect. Of course it wasn't a fairy tale. I still got hate mail. I received messages from people calling me an ungrateful daughter, accusing me of destroying a pillar of the community over a misunderstanding. There were people who would never believe the documents, who would always prefer the comfortable lie of the benevolent Hart family to the messy truth of their fraud. But for the first time in my life, their opinions didn't feel like a cage. I walked into the windcoat pulled tight, knowing that whatever happened next, the story was finally mine. It took 7 months for the dust to settle, and when it did, the landscape of my life looked entirely different. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where the hero walks away with a dragon's hoard of gold. Real litigation is an attrition war, and by the time the lawyers took their cuts and the forensic accountants were paid the millions, in the trust had shrunk significantly. But when the settlement wire finally hit my account on a Tuesday afternoon, I didn't feel disappointed. I felt weightless. I didn't buy a sports car or a penthouse. I did the boring, beautiful things that stability allows. I paid off my student loans in a single click. I fixed the transmission in my sedan. I topped up my retirement fund. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't scanning the horizon for the disaster my parents had always promised was coming. I also did one thing for the past. I took a slice of the recovered funds and established the Hart grant. It wasn't a massive foundation with galas and press releases, just a targeted scholarship for students aging out of the foster system who wanted to pursue paralegal or legal studies. I set it up anonymously. I didn't want the Hart name plastered on a building. I wanted Hazel's legacy to be about giving people the tools to read the fine print, the very tools that had saved me. The consequences for my family were less quiet. Justice, it turned out, was a slow, grinding wheel. My father wasn't dragged away in handcuffs during prime time, but his ending was perhaps more painful for a man like him. He was rendered irrelevant. The investigation into Archer Holdings uncovered a web of wire fraud and tax evasion that went back a decade. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, trading his freedom for house arrest and complete asset forfeiture. The Breakwater estate was seized to pay restitution to the IRS and the creditors he had stiffed. I didn't go to the sentencing, but I saw the photos in the paper. He looked shrunken, stripped of the expensive suits and the arrogance that had been his armor. He looked like exactly what he was, a failed businessman who had cannibalized his own children to keep the lights on. My mother fared no better. Her punishment was social, a death by 1,000 cuts. The charity boards asked for her resignation. The lunch dates dried up. The phone simply stopped ringing. The society that she had preened for the people she had tried to impress by scapegoating me excised her like a tumor the moment her utility ended. I heard through the grapevine that she was living in a small condo near the airport alone, still telling anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a misunderstanding. Leonard Voss was disbarred. The Bar Association takes a dim view of attorneys who facilitate embezzlement against their own clients. Last I heard, he was facing his own indictment for obstruction of justice. The machinery he had greased for years finally caught his tie and pulled him in. A year to the day of the fire, I drove back to the coast. The Breakwater house was empty, a for sale by auction sign staked into the lawn where the tent had once stood. The grass had grown over the scorched patch of earth where the wiring had failed. The air was cold, biting with the smell of salt and approaching winter. I walked down to the shoreline, the gravel crunching under my boots. It was the same spot where I had stood that night, watching the smoke rise, feeling the walls of their narrative closing in on me. I took Hazel's letter out of my pocket. The paper was soft now, worn from being folded and unfolded 100 times. I read the lines again, letting the wind snap the corners of the page. He will call it family money. He will call it protection. Standing there with the gray ocean churning in front of me, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I realized that the money had almost been secondary. The true crime wasn't the embezzlement, it was the theft of my reality. They needed me to be the crazy one so they could be the competent ones. They needed my history to be a tragedy so theirs could remain a triumph. They had tried to steal my name, my credibility, and my mind just to balance a ledger. I looked back at the empty house, a hollow shell that no longer held any power over me. They had spent 20 years building a cage for me, constructing it out of gaslighting, medical records, and whispers. They assumed that once I was inside, I would stay there too broken to fight back. I folded the letter and put it back in my coat pocket, turning away from the sea to walk back to my car. They wanted me caged because cages don't testify. The problem is, I learned how to build keys. And so Marcia walked away from the wreckage of her family, choosing truth and peace over a manufactured inheritance. If you found yourself rooting for her journey and appreciate stories about the long, hard climb toward earned justice, please consider subscribing. We read every single comment of your thoughts on Marcia's ultimate freedom and the fate of the Harts below. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.